The winter of 1887 didn't just take Eleanor Whitmore's hope, it tried to take her life. Alone in a dying cabin, 3 days from starvation, she had given up. The land had already buried her husband. Now it wanted her too. But when a stranger's knock shattered the silence of that frozen hell, everything changed. What walked through that door wasn't salvation, it was a test. And the choice she made in the next 72 hours would either kill her or give her a reason to survive. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. The wind didn't howl anymore. It screamed. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the cabin's single window, her breath fogging the cracked glass, watching snow pile against the door like a burial mound. Outside, the world had disappeared. No horizon, no trees, just white rage in every direction, erasing everything it touched. Inside wasn't much better. The fire had died 2 hours ago. She'd burned the last piece of furniture yesterday, a chair Thomas had made their first winter here, back when they'd believed this land would give them something other than suffering. The wood had gone up fast, too fast, and now the cold was back with a vengeance, seeping through every gap in the walls, turning her breath to fog and her fingers to wood. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. It didn't help. Nothing helped anymore. The cupboards were empty, had been for 3 days. She'd scraped the bottom of the flour sack that morning, mixing the last dusty remnants with snowmelt to make something that resembled paste. It sat heavy in her stomach now, a cold lump that did nothing to stop the hollow ache spreading through her body. Christmas was 2 days away. Not that it mattered. There'd be no celebration, no visitors, no reason to mark the date at all except as another day she'd somehow managed not to die. 3 years. 3 years since they'd lowered Thomas into the frozen ground, his body wrapped in the quilt her mother had made for their wedding. 3 years since pneumonia had ripped through him in less than a week, turning a strong man into a wheezing shadow who couldn't even lift his head to say goodbye. The neighbors had helped at first, brought food, offered to buy the land, but Eleanor had refused, clinging to the only thing she had left of him, this miserable 160 acres of Wyoming. Nothing that had killed him as surely as the fever, pride. That's what her sister had called it in the last letter 6 months ago. Foolish pride, Eleanor. Come back to Boston. There's nothing for you out there but an early grave. Maybe Rebecca had been right. Eleanor turned from the window, surveying the cabin's single room. It had shrunk over the years, or maybe she had. The bed in the corner with its sagging rope frame. The table Thomas had built, now missing a leg because she'd burned it last week. The trunk that held everything she owned, 2 dresses, a coat with holes in the lining, a Bible she hadn't opened since the funeral, and the deed to land that would probably kill her before spring. The walls were closing in. She could feel it, the way the darkness pressed down when the fire died, the way silence became its own kind of noise, filling her ears until she wanted to scream just to break it. But screaming took energy she didn't have. She sank onto the bed, pulling both blankets over herself, even though she knew it wouldn't matter. The cold here wasn't the kind you could hide from. It found you, got into your bones and stayed there, spreading like frost on glass until you couldn't remember what warm felt like. Her stomach cramped. Hunger or fear, she'd stopped being able to tell the difference. The smart thing would be to leave. Hitch the horse, if it was still alive in the lean-to out back, and make for town before the next storm hit. But town was 18 miles through this, and she hadn't seen another soul in 3 weeks. The storm had everyone locked down, assuming anyone was even stupid enough to still be out here this late in the season. Besides, leaving meant admitting defeat, meant accepting that Thomas had died for nothing, that the last 3 years of suffering had been for nothing, that she'd wasted her life trying to honor a dead man's dream instead of building something of her own. The thought made her throat tight. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling beams. Dark water stains spread across the wood where the roof leaked. She'd tried to patch it in the fall, but a repair job had failed, and now ice formed on the inside of the cabin when the temperature dropped far enough. Maybe she'd just stay here. Let the cold take her the way it had taken Thomas. At least then it would be over. No more fighting, no more waking up to discover she'd survived another night she hadn't wanted to survive. The wind hammered the cabin, making the whole structure shudder. Snow hissed against the windows. Somewhere outside, something crashed, probably a branch snapping under the weight of ice. The sound was sharp, violent, and then swallowed immediately by the storm. Eleanor closed her eyes. Sleep would be good. Sleep would make the hours pass faster, bring her closer to whatever end was waiting. And if she didn't wake up, well, that would solve everything, wouldn't it? But sleep wouldn't come. It never did anymore, not real sleep. Just a half-conscious drifting where memories played on repeat, showing her everything she'd lost. Thomas laughing as they'd crossed the Missouri, talking about the life they'd built. Thomas teaching her to shoot, his hand steady on hers as she'd held the rifle. Thomas the last morning, his eyes glassy with fever, trying to say her name and failing. She opened her eyes again, forcing the images away. The cabin creaked, settled. The wind found a new gap to exploit, whistling through it with a sound like someone screaming far away. Eleanor sat up slowly, every joint protesting. She needed to move. Staying still let the cold in faster. She'd learned that the hard way last winter when she'd spent a whole day in bed and woken up unable to feel her feet. She stood, swaying slightly as blood rushed from her head. When was the last time she'd eaten something real? 4 days? 5? Time had started blurring together, one gray day bleeding into the next until she'd stopped bothering to mark them. She crossed to the window again, rubbing a clear spot in the frost with her palm. Nothing but white. The storm had erased the world so completely it was hard to believe anything existed beyond these 4 walls. A thought crept in, cold and seductive. What if nothing does? What if the whole world had frozen over and she was the last one left, trapped in this cabin at the end of everything, waiting for the cold to finish what it had started? She shook her head, trying to clear it. That kind of thinking led nowhere good. She'd learned that too, during the worst days after Thomas died, when her mind had turned on itself and shown her things that weren't there, shadows moving in corners, voices in the wind calling her name. Grief did that. Isolation did that. Hunger definitely did that. She needed to stay grounded, focus on practical things, survival things, except there was nothing left to survive with. No food, no fuel, no options. The cabin's single door rattled in its frame as wind found it. The latch was barely holding. She'd noticed it getting looser over the past week, but hadn't had the energy to fix it. Another thing she'd let slide, like the roof, like the broken window in the back that she'd stuffed with rags, like the gap under the door that let in a constant stream of freezing air. The whole place was falling apart, just like her. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass, feeling it burn against her skin. Maybe she should pray. That's what her mother would have told her to do. But prayer required hope, and hope required the belief that someone was listening, and Eleanor had stopped believing that a long time ago. A year after Thomas died, she'd knelt by his grave and begged for a sign. Any sign. Just something to show her this suffering meant something, that there was a purpose to the pain. Nothing. Just wind and silence and the slow realization that she was completely, utterly alone. She'd stopped praying after that. The cold was getting worse. She could feel it spreading through the cabin, reclaiming the small warmth the morning fire had created. By nightfall, it would be unbearable. And she had nothing left to burn except the bed frame, which she'd been saving because once that was gone, she'd be sleeping on the floor, and sleeping on the floor in this cold was a death sentence. Choices. It always came down to choices. Burn the bed and stay warm tonight, or freeze now and save it for later. Die fast or die slow. Some choice. Eleanor turned from the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Her dress hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and now the fabric that had fit perfectly 3 years ago bagged around her like she was a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. She caught her reflection in the window's dark glass. Hollow eyes, sharp cheekbones, hair that had once been carefully pinned now hanging in a loose, tangled mess around her face. She looked like a ghost. Felt like one too. The wind shifted, driving snow against the door so hard it sounded like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. The latch rattled again, and Eleanor found herself staring at it, wondering if this would be the storm that finally tore the door clean off its hinges and let the cold rush in to finish her. Part of her hoped it would. At least then the waiting would be over. She moved to the bed, sitting down heavily. The rope frame creaked under her weight, what little weight she had left. She should probably try to sleep again. There wasn't anything else to do. and unconsciousness would make the time pass faster, bring her closer to… What? She didn't even know anymore. Tomorrow, maybe. Tomorrow she'd make a decision. Try for town or stay put. Live or let go. But not today. Today she was too tired. She pulled the blankets up, layering them over her body even though they barely helped. The cold was inside her now, had been for weeks, living in her bones and her blood and her breath. External warmth couldn't touch it. The cabin groaned as wind hit it from a new direction. Snow rattled against the roof like fingernails. Eleanor closed her eyes. And that's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, sharp, distinct, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Her eyes flew open. She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, wondering if hunger had finally pushed her over the edge into hearing things that weren't there. But then it came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Someone was at the door. Eleanor sat up slowly, her heart suddenly hammering in a way it hadn't in months. Fear flooded through her, sharp and clarifying, burning away the fog that had settled over her thoughts. No one should be out in this. No one with any sense would be traveling in a storm like this, which meant whoever was knocking was either desperate or dangerous. Maybe both. She stayed on the bed, frozen, as the knocking came a third time. Harder now. More insistent. Hello? A voice muffled by wind and wood. Male. Anyone in there? Eleanor's throat worked, but no sound came out. She hadn't spoken to another person in 3 weeks. Hadn't heard another voice in longer than that. The sound of it now felt foreign, almost threatening. I know someone's in there, the voice called again. I saw smoke from your chimney yesterday. Please, I need shelter. Yesterday's fire. The chair she'd burned. Of course, someone would have seen the smoke. It was the only sign of life for miles. Eleanor stood on shaking legs, her mind racing. Let him in or send him away. The smart thing would be to refuse. She didn't know this man, had no way to defend herself if he meant harm. The rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot was in the corner, but she hadn't cleaned it in a year and had no ammunition anyway. But if she sent him away and he died in the storm, that blood would be on her hands. Assuming he was real. Assuming this wasn't her mind finally breaking under the weight of isolation and grief. The knocking came again, followed by a sound that might have been coughing or cursing or both. Ma'am, I'm freezing out here. I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to get out of this wind. The voice sounded genuine, tired, desperate, like her. Eleanor moved toward the door, each step feeling like a decision she couldn't take back. Her hand touched the latch, cold enough to burn her palm. Who are you? Her voice came out rough, unused. What do you want? Name's Caleb Mercer. I'm trying to make it to Laramie, but my horse threw a shoe about 5 miles back and this storm came out of nowhere. I've been walking for 2 hours. Please. 2 hours in this storm would kill a man. Eleanor knew that. Had seen it happen to their neighbor, old Mr. Peterson, who tried to make it home from town during a blizzard 2 winters ago and been found frozen solid 50 feet from his own door. She looked back at the cabin, at the empty cupboards, the dead fire. The bed she'd been ready to die in 5 minutes ago. What did it matter? She had nothing worth protecting, and if he killed her, well, that would solve her problem too, wouldn't it? The thought should have scared her. Instead, it felt almost like relief. Eleanor lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The storm hit her like a fist, wind and snow driving into the cabin with such force it nearly knocked her backward. And there, hunched against the cold, was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, covered head to toe in snow so thick she could barely make out his features. He had a pack on his back, one hand braced against the doorframe, the other pressed to his side. Their eyes met. His were dark, shadowed with exhaustion, and something else, pain, maybe, or fear. But not malice. She'd learned to recognize malice in men's eyes after Thomas died, when some of the neighbors had come around with offers that had nothing to do with land. This man just looked tired. Thank you, he managed through chattering teeth. Eleanor stepped back, and he stumbled inside, bringing the storm with him. She threw her weight against the door, fighting the wind until she could slam it shut and drop the latch back into place. Silence crashed down, broken only by the man's harsh breathing and the muffled scream of wind outside. They stood there, 3 feet apart, staring at each other in the dim light filtering through the frost-covered windows. Eleanor saw him clearly now, maybe 35, give or take, dark hair plastered to his head with melting snow, a few days of beard growth, a face that had seen weather and hard work, lined around the eyes but not cruel. His coat was good quality but worn, and under it he wore work clothes, the kind a rancher or farmer would wear. He was shaking, violent tremors running through his whole body. "You're half frozen," Eleanor heard herself say. "More than half." His voice was steadier now, but his lips had a blue tinge that made her chest tight. "Is that your fire?" He was looking at the cold hearth, the pile of ashes where her last warmth had died hours ago. "It went out." "You got more wood?" "No." The word hung between them, heavy with everything it meant. No wood, no fuel, no way to fight the cold. Caleb, if that was really his name, lowered his pack to the floor with a grunt that sounded like pain. He pressed his hand to his side again, and Eleanor saw him wince. "You're hurt." "Fell when the horse bolted. Might have cracked a rib." He straightened carefully, looking around the cabin, taking in the empty cupboards, the missing table leg, the desperate poverty of everything. Eleanor waited for judgment, for pity, for the same look she'd gotten from the neighbors before they'd stopped coming, the one that said she was pathetic for staying, for clinging to nothing, for choosing slow death over admitting defeat. But Caleb just nodded, like he understood. "You been alone long?" 3 years. "Husband?" "Dead." "I'm sorry." The words were simple, but something in the way he said them made Eleanor believe he meant it. Not the automatic sympathy people offered because they thought they should, but real understanding, the kind that came from knowing what loss felt like. Caleb moved to the hearth, kneeling despite the obvious pain it caused him. He reached into his pack and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "I've got some things. Not much, but enough to get us through the night." Us. Like they were in this together now. Eleanor watched as he unwrapped the bundle, revealing strips of dried wood, kindling, carefully prepared and protected from the storm. He arranged it in the hearth with practiced efficiency, then pulled out a small metal container. "Step back," he said. She did, and he opened the container, shaking something onto the kindling. The sharp smell of kerosene hit her nose. He struck a match. The fire caught instantly, flames leaping up with an eagerness that made Eleanor's eyes sting. Heat rolled out in waves, and she found herself moving closer without meaning to, drawn to it like a moth. Caleb added more kindling, building the fire carefully, nursing it into something that could sustain itself. The light grew, pushing back the gray dimness that had filled the cabin, making shadows dance on the walls. "That's better," he said, sitting back on his heels. Then he looked up at her. "When did you last eat?" Eleanor's pride flared. "I'm fine." That wasn't the question. She met his eyes, ready to tell him to mind his own business, but the expression on his face stopped her. No pity. Just a question. 4 days, she admitted. Maybe 5. He didn't react, just reached into his pack again. This time he pulled out a cloth bundle, and when he unwrapped it, Eleanor saw bread. Real bread, probably a day old but still soft, and cheese, and some kind of dried meat. Her stomach clenched so hard it hurt. "Here." He tore off a piece of bread and held it out. "Go slow. If you haven't eaten in that long, too much too fast will make you sick." Eleanor took the bread with trembling hands. It was still slightly warm from being inside his pack, close to his body. She bit into it and the taste exploded across her tongue. Salt and yeast and life. She had to force herself not to stuff the whole thing in her mouth at once. Caleb watched her eat, then took a piece for himself. They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, eating bread and cheese while the storm tried to tear the world apart outside. "Why were you going to Laramie in this?" Eleanor asked finally. "Had business, thought I could beat the storm." He grimaced. "I was wrong. You'll die if you try to leave now." "I know." Another silence, this one longer. "How bad is your rib?" Eleanor asked. "Bad enough, but I've had worse." "Let me see." He looked at her, surprised. "You know medicine?" "Some. My husband got hurt a lot working this land. I learned." That was putting it kindly. Thomas had been reckless, always pushing too hard, and she'd spent half their marriage patching him up. It hadn't saved him in the end, but she'd learned enough to know when a man was pretending he wasn't as hurt as he really was. Caleb hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned his coat and shirt. Eleanor moved closer as he pulled the fabric aside, revealing a bruise that spread across his left ribs like spilled ink, purple and black and angry red at the edges. She pressed gently along the discoloration, feeling for breaks. Caleb hissed when she hit a particular spot, his whole body going rigid. Cracked, she confirmed, maybe broken, hard to tell without seeing inside. Can you bind it? Eleanor looked around the cabin. She didn't have bandages, didn't have anything medical except some whiskey she'd been saving for. She didn't even know what. But she had strips torn from an old sheet in the trunk. They'd have to do. She retrieved them and returned to Caleb, who had gotten his shirt the rest of the way off. His torso was lean, muscled from hard work, marked with scars that told stories she didn't ask about. This is going to hurt, she warned. Everything hurts already. Eleanor wrapped the binding around his ribs, pulling it tight enough to provide support without restricting his breathing too much. Caleb's jaw clenched, but he didn't make a sound. When she finished, he nodded. Thank you. It's the least I can do. You brought food. Fair trade, then. He pulled his shirt back on, moving carefully. The fire had warmed the cabin enough that Eleanor could feel her fingers again, could think more clearly than she had in days. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, two strangers sat by a fire, alive when by all rights they should both be dead. Eleanor looked at the man who'd knocked on her door, at the supplies he'd brought, at the fire he'd built, and she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about being ready to die. The fire changed everything, not just the temperature, though that mattered the way warmth crept back into Eleanor's fingers and toes, making them ache as feeling returned. But the light changed things too, made the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a place where people actually lived, or could live anyway. Eleanor sat on the bed, watching Caleb tend the fire. He moved like a man used to taking care of himself, efficient but not rushed, adding wood piece by piece to keep the flames steady. Every so often he'd press his hand to his ribs, a quick, unconscious gesture that told her the pain was worse than he'd admitted. You should rest, she said. So should you. I've done nothing but rest for 3 days. That's not rest. That's waiting to die. He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment, and Eleanor found she couldn't argue. The storm outside had settled into a steady assault, wind driving snow against the walls in waves that made the whole structure shudder. Night was coming. She could feel it in the way the light through the windows shifted from gray to darker gray, the temperature dropping even with the fire going. Storm's not letting up, Caleb said, echoing her thoughts. They don't. Not this time of year. Could go for days. You've seen worse? Last winter we had one that lasted a week. Snowed so much we couldn't open the door. Had to dig our way out. She stopped, realizing what she'd said. I mean, when my husband was alive. Caleb nodded but didn't push. Instead, he pulled his pack closer, rummaging through it. I've got more supplies. Not a lot, but some. We should take inventory, see what we're working with. Eleanor watched as he laid items out on the floor between them. More dried meat, wrapped carefully in cloth. A small bag of coffee beans that made her chest ache with want. She hadn't had real coffee in 8 months. A tin of hardtack. Some dried fruit that looked like it had seen better days but was still edible. A canteen half full of water. I had more, he said, but the horse took off with most of it when he bolted. This is what I grabbed before he was out of reach. You're lucky you got this much. Luck. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's one word for it. Eleanor stood and moved to her own trunk, pulling out the few things she had left. A quarter bag of cornmeal, some salt, the whiskey she'd fetched earlier. She set them next to Caleb's supplies, and the contrast was stark. His small stash looked like abundance next to her poverty. Between the two of us, Caleb said, studying the combined pile, we might make it 3 days. 4 if we're careful. And if the storm lasts a week, then we get creative. Eleanor almost laughed. Creative, as if there was anything left in this cabin worth using. She'd already burned most of the furniture. The walls were paper thin. Stripping them for fuel would just let the cold in faster. There's the bed frame, she said quietly. Caleb looked at the bed, then at her. You been sleeping on that? Where else? How long since you had a real meal before today? The question caught her off guard. I told you, 4 or 5 days. Before that? Eleanor thought about it, really thought about it. When had she last eaten until she was full? Not just enough to quiet the hunger pangs, but actually satisfied? November, she admitted. Maybe late October. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not pity. She would have hated pity. Something else. Understanding, maybe. You've been starving yourself slow, he said. I've been surviving. That's not surviving. That's just taking longer to die. The words hit harder than they should have, probably because they were true. Eleanor turned away, moving back to the window. The glass had frosted over again, blocking any view of the outside world. Why'd you stay? Caleb asked behind her. What? Out here. Alone. After your husband died, why didn't you leave? Eleanor's hands curled into fists. That's none of your business. You're right. It's not. A pause. But we're stuck here together for at least a few days, and I figure we might as well talk. Unless you'd rather sit in silence. She should tell him to keep quiet, to mind his own problems and let her mind hers. But the truth was, she'd barely spoken to anyone in 3 years, and the isolation had been eating at her almost as much as the hunger. I stayed because leaving felt like quitting, she said finally, still facing the window. Thomas died trying to make something of this place. If I left, it would mean he died for nothing. And now? Now I don't know anymore. The admission felt like defeat. Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass, feeling it burn against her skin. Behind her, she heard Caleb moving, then his voice, closer than before. My wife died 4 years ago. Childbirth. The baby, too. Eleanor turned to find him standing a few feet away, his expression carefully neutral. We had a ranch in Colorado, he continued. Small operation, just us and a couple hired hands. She wanted a family. I did too. Thought we had time. He stopped, his jaw working. Turns out, we didn't. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. He moved back to the fire, lowering himself carefully to the floor. I stayed after, like you. Thought I owed it to her. Kept the ranch running, worked myself half to death trying to make it mean something. But the place just reminded me of everything I'd lost. So about a year ago I sold it. Been traveling since. Where are you going? Anywhere that's not there. He looked up at her. Sometimes leaving isn't quitting. Sometimes it's just survival. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor moved away from the window and sat down on the floor across from him, the fire warm between them. What kind of business do you have in Laramie? She asked. Might buy into a ranch there. Partnership deal with a man I knew in Colorado. He's got the land, needs someone who knows cattle. Caleb shrugged. Or I might keep moving, haven't decided yet. That's a hell of a way to live. No roots, no home. Says the woman who's been slowly dying in a collapsing cabin. Eleanor felt her face flush. That's different. Is it? She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because maybe it wasn't different. Maybe they were both just stuck. Her to a place that was killing her. Him to a wandering that would never fill the hole his wife had left. The fire crackled. Wind hammered the walls. Somewhere in the rafters, something creaked. We should eat again, Caleb said, breaking the silence. Small portions, but regular. Keep our strength up. He divided some of the dried meat and fruit between them. Eleanor ate slowly, forcing herself to chew thoroughly even though her body screamed for her to devour it all at once. Tell me about your husband, Caleb said. Why? Because talking about them helps. Trust me. Eleanor studied him, trying to decide if he meant it or if this was just something people said. But his expression was open, genuine. Thomas was stubborn, she said finally. Reckless. Always thought he could do more than was reasonable. He'd work from sunup to sundown, pushing too hard, hurting himself. She smiled despite herself. I spent half our marriage telling him to slow down. Did he listen? Never. He was convinced we could make this land work, said we'd have a real house by the end of the first year, cattle by the second, a family by the third. Her smile faded. We barely made it through the first winter. The second almost killed us both. And the third killed him. Yes, Caleb nodded slowly. Sarah, my wife, she used to talk about the children we'd have. Had names picked out and everything. 3 boys, 2 girls. She had it all planned. He poked at the fire with a stick. When she died, those plans died too, and I didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know how to want anything when the person I'd wanted everything with was gone. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Because, yes, that was it exactly. Thomas had been the one who dreamed. She'd just followed along, believing in his vision because he'd believed so hard. And when he died, the dreams died with him, leaving her with nothing but this land and a promise she didn't even remember making. Do you still miss her? She asked quietly. Every day. But it's different now. Less sharp. More like an ache than a knife. Caleb looked at her. Does it get easier for you? I don't know. I stopped paying attention to how it felt. Just tried to get through each day. That's not living. I know. The admission hung in the air between them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The walls didn't feel quite so close. The silence wasn't quite so suffocating. They sat by the fire as darkness fell completely, the only light coming from the flames. Caleb told her about Colorado, about the ranch he'd built and then walked away from. Eleanor told him about Boston, about the life she'd left behind when she married Thomas, about the sister who kept writing letters telling her to come home. Why don't you? Caleb asked. Pride, mostly. Rebecca was right about everything. She said the West would eat me alive. Said Thomas was a dreamer with no sense. Said I'd regret leaving. Eleanor stared into the fire. Can't go back and admit she was right about all of it. That's a stupid reason to die. Probably. Caleb laughed, a short bark of sound. At least you're honest about it. What else is there to be? They fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Comfortable, almost. The kind of silence that existed between people who understood each other without having to explain everything. Eleanor felt exhaustion creeping in. Real exhaustion, not the numb fatigue she'd been living with. Her body was warm for the first time in days. Her stomach had food in it, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't alone. You should sleep, Caleb said, noticing her eyes drooping. Take the bed. I'll keep the fire going. You need rest too. Your rib will hurt whether I'm lying down or sitting up. Might as well be useful. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She moved to the bed, pulling the blankets up. They felt warmer than they had in months, probably because the cabin was actually warm enough for them to matter. She lay there, listening to Caleb add wood to the fire, listening to the storm try to tear the world apart outside. And for the first time since Thomas died, she fell asleep without hoping she wouldn't wake up. When Eleanor opened her eyes, gray light filled the cabin. Morning. The storm was still going, but the wind had dropped to a steady howl instead of the screaming rage of the night before. She sat up, disoriented. The fire was still burning. Caleb must have tended it through the night. And there he was, slumped against the wall near the hearth, asleep sitting up. Eleanor studied him in the dim light. His face was drawn, tight with pain even in sleep. Keeping the fire going all night with cracked ribs must have been agony. She stood quietly, moving to the fire. Added wood carefully, trying not to wake him, but his eyes opened anyway, tracking her movements. Morning, he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. You should have woken me. We could have traded off. You needed the sleep more than I did. Eleanor wanted to argue, but he was probably right. She felt more rested than she had in months, despite everything. How's your rib? She asked. Still attached. That's something. He pushed himself upright with a grimace. Storm still going? Sounds like it. Caleb moved to the window, rubbing a clear spot in the frost. Can't see more than a few feet. We're stuck here at least another day. Probably more. He nodded, accepting it. Then we better make the best of it. What needs fixing in here? Eleanor looked around the cabin. What didn't need fixing? The roof leaked. The door latch was loose. The back window was stuffed with rags instead of glass. Half the chinking between the logs had fallen out, letting in drafts. Everything, she said honestly. Then we'll start with what'll keep us alive. The door first. If that latch fails in this wind, we're done. Then the gaps in the walls. The roof can wait until the storm passes. He was already moving, examining the door, testing the latch. Eleanor watched him work, something stirring in her chest that she couldn't quite name. It had been so long since anyone had helped her with anything. So long since anyone had acted like her survival mattered. "You got any tools?" Caleb asked. Eleanor pulled Thomas's old toolbox from under the bed. It wasn't much. A hammer, some nails that were more rust than metal, a knife that needed sharpening. But Caleb nodded like it was treasure. "This'll do. You got any spare wood? I burned most of it." "The bed frame?" Eleanor hesitated. That frame was the last piece of furniture she had. Once it was gone, she'd be sleeping on the floor. "We can reinforce the door with part of it," Caleb said, reading her expression. "Leave enough for the bed to hold. It's not pretty, but it'll work." Together they dismantled one side of the bed frame, Caleb directing while Eleanor did most of the work. His ribs made it too painful for him to do the heavy lifting. They used the wood to brace the door, nailing it in place until the whole thing felt solid instead of like it might blow away at any moment. Then they moved to the walls, stuffing gaps with strips torn from the extra blanket in Eleanor's trunk. It hurt to destroy the blanket. It had been her grandmother's, but staying warm mattered more than sentiment. By midday, they'd done what they could. The cabin wasn't perfect, but it was better, tighter, warmer. They ate again, small portions of hardtack and dried meat washed down with water that Caleb had melted from snow. Eleanor made coffee with the beans he'd brought, and the smell alone was enough to make her want to cry. "Haven't had real coffee since last spring," she admitted, wrapping her hands around the tin cup. "Tastes like heaven, doesn't it? Tastes like I'm alive." Caleb looked at her over his own cup. "You are alive, Eleanor, even if you've been trying hard not to be." She wanted to deny it, but what was the point? He was right. She had been trying not to be alive, or at least not trying very hard to stay that way. "Why do you care?" she asked instead. "What? Why do you care if I live or die? You don't know me. This isn't your problem." Caleb set his cup down carefully. "Because I know what it's like to give up. And I know what it's like when someone gives a damn enough to stop you." He paused. "After Sarah died, I tried to work myself to death. Just kept pushing until my body gave out. One of my ranch hands found me passed out in the barn, half frozen. He dragged me inside, made me eat, made me rest, told me I was being an idiot." He smiled slightly. "I hated him for it at the time, but he was right." "What happened to him?" "Still running that ranch in Colorado, far as I know. Good man. Deserved a better boss than me." Eleanor sipped her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. "I don't know how to stop." "Stop what?" "Giving up. I don't know how to start caring again." "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just survive today. Tomorrow, you can survive tomorrow." It sounded simple when he said it like that. Too simple. But maybe that was the point. They spent the afternoon talking. Really talking, not just exchanging information, but sharing the pieces of themselves they'd kept locked away. Caleb told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the day he met Sarah at a church social and knew immediately she was the one. Eleanor told him about Boston, about her father's store, about how Thomas had come through town with a wagon train and swept her off her feet with promises of adventure. "Did you love him?" Caleb asked. Eleanor thought about it, really thought about it. "I loved who he was, his optimism, his certainty. He made me feel like anything was possible." She paused. "But I don't know if I loved him the way you loved Sarah. I don't know if I knew him long enough to love him that deep. That's honest. He died after 3 years of marriage. Most of those years we spent just trying not to freeze or starve. There wasn't a lot of time for romance. Still counts, still hurts when they're gone." "Yeah, it does." Night fell again, and they prepared the same way. Small meal, fire tended, silence settling around them. But this time, when Eleanor lay down, Caleb settled on the floor near the hearth instead of sitting up all night. "Your rib needs rest," Eleanor said. "So does yours." She almost smiled. Almost. The second day blurred into the third. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and their supplies were running low. They rationed carefully, eating just enough to keep functioning. Caleb showed Eleanor how to make the dried meat last longer by making it into a thin broth with the cornmeal. It wasn't much, but it filled their bellies and gave them something warm to drink besides coffee. They worked on the cabin during the day. Caleb fixed the back window using pieces of oilcloth from his pack. Eleanor patched more gaps in the walls. At night they talked, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. And slowly, something shifted in Eleanor. The numbness she'd been living with started to crack. She found herself laughing at one of Caleb's stories about a stubborn cow. Found herself actually tasting the food instead of just swallowing it. Found herself noticing things, the way firelight played on the walls, the sound of Caleb's voice, the fact that she'd woken up that morning and not immediately wished she hadn't. Small things, but they mattered. On the fourth morning, Eleanor woke to silence. Real silence. No wind, no snow battering the walls. She sat up fast, her heart jumping. Caleb was already at the window, looking out. "Storm's over," he said. Eleanor joined him, peering through the glass. The world outside was buried in white. Snowdrifts 5 feet high against the cabin walls. The landscape completely transformed. But the sky was clear, pale blue stretching to the horizon. "We can dig out today," Caleb said. "Clear a path. See what's what." But there was something in his voice, a hesitation. Eleanor looked at him. "You're leaving." "Got to. That business in Laramie won't wait forever." "Right, of course." They stood there, not looking at each other, the silence between them suddenly heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Caleb turned to face her. "Come with me." Eleanor's breath caught. "What?" "Come with me. To Laramie. Hell, come to wherever I end up going next. Just don't stay here." His voice was urgent now, almost desperate. "Eleanor, this place is killing you. You know it is. You've known it since before I showed up. If I leave you here, I'll be fine. You'll be dead by spring." The words hit like a slap. Eleanor wanted to deny it, but she couldn't, because he was right. "I can't just leave," she said instead. "Why not?" "This land is dirt, just dirt. It's not worth your life." "Thomas died for this land." "Thomas is dead. You're not. Not yet." Caleb grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. You don't owe him this. You don't owe anyone slow suicide. If you want to honor his memory, do it by living, by finding something worth living for." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I don't know how." "Then learn. Come with me and learn." It was crazy, completely insane. She barely knew this man. He was a stranger who'd stumbled into her life 4 days ago. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to believe anything would be better anywhere else. But she also had no reason to stay. The cabin pressed in around her, the empty cupboards, the patched walls, the bed frame they'd torn apart to survive. Everything here was death wearing different faces, and Caleb was offering life. Maybe it wouldn't work out. Maybe she'd regret it. Maybe she'd end up alone again in 6 months or a year, but at least she'd be alive to regret it. Eleanor met Caleb's eyes and saw hope there, real hope, the kind she'd forgotten existed. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay? I'll come with you." The relief on his face was so profound it made her chest ache. He pulled her into a hug, careful of his ribs, and Eleanor let herself be held, let herself feel something besides grief and exhaustion and resignation. When they pulled apart, Caleb was smiling. "We should leave soon as we can dig out, before another storm hits." "I need to pack." "Pack light, just what you need." Eleanor looked around the cabin one last time, at the bed where she'd slept next to Thomas, at the table he'd built, at the walls that had protected them and imprisoned her in equal measure. 3 years she'd spent here. 3 years of her life poured into this place, and now she was walking away. It should have felt like betrayal, like failure. Instead, it felt like breathing after being underwater too long. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. They spent the rest of the morning digging out. The snow had piled so high against the door that Caleb had to climb out through the window first, his face going white as he twisted his body through the narrow opening. Eleanor heard him grunt in pain when he dropped to the ground outside, landing hard in a drift that came up to his thighs. "You all right?" she called through the window. Fine. His voice was strained. Just need a minute. Eleanor waited, listening to him move around the cabin's exterior, the sound of a shovel scraping against wood. She didn't even remember she had a shovel until she heard it. Must have been leaning against the wall, buried under the first snowfall. After 20 minutes, Caleb had cleared enough that Eleanor could push the door open. She stepped out into a world transformed. Everything was white, the landscape smoothed over like someone had pulled a blanket across it. The lean-to where she'd kept her horse had collapsed under the weight of the snow. She could see one corner of the roof poking through the drift, but nothing else. Your horse? Caleb asked, following her gaze. Eleanor shook her head. Dead. Probably a month ago. I couldn't feed him, so I let him go. Figured he'd have a better chance finding food on his own. Smart. He didn't make it anyway. Found him frozen about a mile from here, a few weeks back. They stood in silence, looking at the buried lean-to. Then Caleb turned away, surveying the rest of the property. What there was of it, a few fence posts sticking up through the snow, the outline of what might have been a garden plot. Nothing else. Just empty white stretching in every direction. How far to town? He asked. 18 miles northeast. And to my place in Laramie? Never been. But I'd guess 40, maybe 50 miles west? Caleb nodded slowly, calculating. We'll need to make for town first. Get supplies. A horse for you if we can. Then head to Laramie from there. I don't have money for a horse. I do. Enough, anyway. Eleanor wanted to argue, pride flaring hot in her chest. But what was the point? She had nothing. He had at least something. And if she was going to survive the trip, she'd need to swallow her pride and accept help. Still tasted bitter, though. I need to pack, she said. Inside the cabin, Eleanor stood in the middle of the single room and tried to figure out what to take. Everything she owned was here, but most of it was worthless. Clothes worn thin, a few books with water-damaged pages. Thomas's tools, rusted and broken. She pulled the trunk open and stared at the contents. 2 dresses besides the one she was wearing, both patched and faded. A coat that had been good quality once, but now had holes in the lining and a torn pocket. Undergarments. A pair of boots that needed new soles. The Bible she hadn't opened in 3 years. Some letters from Rebecca, the paper yellowed and creased from being read over and over. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of cloth, Thomas's wedding ring. She'd taken it off his finger before they buried him. Couldn't stand the thought of it going into the ground, even though leaving it on would have been proper. Now she held it up to the light, watching it gleam dully. It was scratched, bent slightly out of round from all the hard work he'd done wearing it. Eleanor closed her fist around it. Then she tucked it into her pocket. She packed the dresses, the undergarments, the least damaged coat. Left the books. Too heavy, too impractical. Left the Bible. She had no use for it anymore. Left Thomas's tools and most of his other possessions. They belonged here, with this land that had killed him. The letters from Rebecca, though, those she kept, folded them carefully and tucked them into the inside pocket of the coat. When she emerged from the cabin with her small bundle, Caleb was waiting with his pack already secured. He looked at what she was carrying and didn't comment on how little it was. Ready? He asked. Eleanor turned to look at the cabin one last time. It looked smaller from the outside, more pathetic. A single-room shack with a sagging roof and gaps in the walls that she could see even from here. This was what Thomas had died for. This was what she'd been willing to die for. It seemed insane now. Yeah, she said. I'm ready. They started walking. The snow was deep, sometimes up to their knees, and progress was slow. Caleb led the way, breaking trail, but Eleanor could see the effort costing him. He kept one hand pressed to his ribs, his breathing labored. We should rest, she said after the first mile. We need to put distance in while the weather holds. You're going to collapse if you don't rest. He stopped, turning to face her. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're hurt, and you've barely slept in 4 days, and you're trying to break trail through 3 feet of snow. Stop being stubborn. Caleb opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. After a moment, he nodded. They found a spot where the wind had blown the snow thinner, sat down on a fallen log that was barely visible under the white. Eleanor studied the landscape while they rested. She'd lived here 3 years and never really looked at it. Not properly. It was just the place that had trapped her. But now, seeing it as something she was leaving behind, she noticed things. The way the hills rolled in the distance, how the snow caught the light and turned everything silver. The absolute silence, broken only by the occasional crack of ice-laden branches. It was beautiful, in a harsh way. Unforgiving, but beautiful. "You having second thoughts?" Caleb asked. "No, just noticing things I never noticed before." "Like what?" "Like how this place might have been good, if things had been different, if Thomas hadn't pushed so hard, if we'd had more help, if the winters hadn't been so brutal." She paused. Or maybe it was always going to fail. Maybe some land just isn't meant to be farmed. Probably both. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong approach. "You think we're making a mistake, leaving in winter like this?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I think staying would be a bigger mistake. At least this way we're trying." They walked for hours. The sun climbed to its zenith, pale and cold, then started its descent. Eleanor's legs burned with the effort of pushing through the snow, and her lungs ached from breathing the frigid air. But she kept moving, matching Caleb's pace step for step. By late afternoon, they'd covered maybe 6 miles, not even halfway to town. "We need to find shelter," Caleb said, scanning the landscape. "Can't be out here when dark falls." "There's nothing out here, just empty land." "There has to be something, a barn, an abandoned homestead, anything." Eleanor thought about it. "Peterson's place is maybe 2 miles north of here, or was. He died 2 winters ago. Don't know if the buildings are still standing. Worth checking." They changed direction, angling north. The extra distance made Eleanor want to scream. Every step away from town was a step they'd have to make up tomorrow. But Caleb was right. They couldn't survive a night in the open, not with his injury and their limited supplies. Peterson's homestead appeared as the sun touched the horizon, a dark shape rising from the white. As they got closer, Eleanor could see the main house had partially collapsed. The roof caved in on one side. But the barn was still standing, and that was enough. Inside, the barn was dark and cold, but at least it blocked the wind. There were a few old stalls, some rotting hay in one corner. A hayloft above that looked like it might hold their weight if they were careful. "This'll work," Caleb said. He was breathing hard, his face pale with pain and exhaustion. Eleanor helped him lower his pack to the ground, then guided him to sit against the wall. "Let me check your ribs." "They're fine." "Let me check anyway." He didn't argue this time, which told her how bad he was feeling. Eleanor unbuttoned his coat and shirt, unwrapped the binding she'd put on days ago. The bruise had spread, dark purple bleeding into green and yellow at the edges. When she pressed gently along his side, he hissed. "It's worse," she said. "I know. You shouldn't be walking. You should be in bed, resting." "Well, we don't have a bed, and we need to get to town." He caught her hand. "I'm okay, Eleanor. I've been hurt worse." She wanted to believe him, but the pain in his eyes told a different story. Still, what choice did they have? They couldn't stay here. Peterson's barn might keep them alive one night, maybe 2, but they had no food left and no way to get any except pushing forward. "We'll rest here tonight," Eleanor said. "Give your ribs a break. Start fresh in the morning." Caleb nodded, too exhausted to argue. They had no wood for a fire, so Eleanor gathered what dry hay she could find and piled it around them for insulation. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They shared the last of their food, a few pieces of dried meat and some hardtack that had gotten wet and refrozen into something that barely qualified as edible. "Tomorrow, we'll reach town," Caleb said. "Get real food. A warm bed. If we make it that far, we'll make it." Eleanor wished she had his certainty, but the 12 miles still ahead of them felt impossible, especially with Caleb injured. And what if they didn't make it to town before dark tomorrow? What if another storm hit? She pushed the thoughts away. One thing at a time. That's what Caleb had told her. Survive today, worry about tomorrow when it came. They huddled together in the hay as darkness fell, sharing body heat. Eleanor could feel Caleb shivering beside her, his breathing shallow and tight. "Tell me about Laramie," she said, trying to distract him from the pain. "Not much to tell. It's a railroad town, growing fast. Probably 5,000–6,000 people by now. That's huge. Compared to what you're used to, yeah. Got hotels, shops, even a theater from what I hear. Eleanor tried to imagine it. 6,000 people. She'd grown up in Boston, so cities weren't foreign to her, but after 3 years of isolation, the thought of being around that many people was almost overwhelming. "What's this ranch you might buy into?" she asked. "Belongs to a man named Jack Morrison. We worked together in Colorado a few years back. He moved to Wyoming, started building a cattle operation. Sent me a letter last year saying he needed a partner, someone who knew the business. And you're interested? Maybe. Depends what he's offering, what the terms are." Caleb shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. "Might be good to have roots again, or might be a disaster. Won't know until I see it." "What happens to me when we get there?" The question had been circling Eleanor's mind since she'd agreed to leave. She'd said yes to coming with Caleb, but she hadn't thought through what that actually meant. Where would she stay? What would she do? She had no skills beyond keeping house and basic farming, and she doubted there was much call for either in a town that size. "You'll stay at the ranch," Caleb said, like it was obvious. "Morrison's got a bunkhouse, extra rooms. You can help out until you figure out what you want to do next." "I can't just live there for free." "Why not? You'll work. Everyone works on a ranch. You'll earn your keep." It sounded simple when he said it like that, but Eleanor knew nothing was ever that simple. People would talk. A woman living on a ranch with unmarried men. It didn't matter that it was practical, that it was survival. People would make it into something ugly. "What will people think?" she asked quietly. "About what?" "About me. Living there with you." Caleb was silent for a moment. "Let them think what they want. Anyone who matters will see you're just someone who needed help. Anyone who doesn't see that isn't worth worrying about." Eleanor wanted to believe that, but she'd spent enough time in small communities to know how quickly gossip spread, how easily reputations were destroyed. "I don't want to make trouble for you," she said. "You won't. And if you do, I'll handle it." He turned his head to look at her in the darkness. "Eleanor, stop trying to find reasons this won't work. We're doing this. We're going to Laramie. You're going to stay at the ranch, and we're both going to figure out how to keep living. That's all that matters right now." The confidence in his voice steadied her. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was overthinking it. She had a tendency to do that, plan for disasters that hadn't happened yet, worry about problems that might never materialize. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Okay. I'll stop borrowing trouble." She felt rather than saw Caleb smile. "Good. Now try to sleep. We've got a long day tomorrow." But sleep wouldn't come. Eleanor lay in the hay listening to Caleb's labored breathing, feeling the cold seep in despite their efforts to insulate themselves. Her mind kept spinning, imagining everything that could go wrong. They could freeze before reaching town. Caleb's rib could puncture his lung. Another storm could trap them here with no food. Or they could make it to Laramie and discover Morrison's ranch was a disaster. Or Caleb could decide he didn't want the partnership. Or Eleanor could find herself alone in a strange town with no money and no prospects. So many ways for this to fail. But also, a voice whispered in the back of her mind, also ways it could work. That was the terrifying part. Not the possibility of failure. She'd gotten comfortable with failure over the last 3 years. But the possibility of success? Of things actually working out? That scared her more than anything. Because if she let herself hope and it fell apart, she didn't know if she'd survive it again. Eleanor must have dozed off eventually because she woke to pale gray light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls. Caleb was already awake, trying to stand. He made it halfway up before his face went white and he sat back down hard. "Don't," Eleanor said, crawling over to him. "Don't try to move yet. We need to get going. In a minute, let me check your ribs first." This time when she unwrapped the binding, she found blood. Not a lot, but enough to make her stomach drop. The skin over one of the ribs had split, probably from all the walking yesterday, and the wound was seeping. "You're bleeding," she said. "I can feel it." "We need to clean this." "With what? We've got no water, no bandages, nothing." He was right. Everything they had was back at the cabin or lost with his horse. Eleanor looked around the barn desperately, as if supplies would magically appear. But there was nothing, just rotting hay and old wood and them. "I'll pack snow on it," she said finally. "Try to clean it that way." She went outside and scooped clean snow into her hands, brought it back inside. Caleb gritted his teeth as she pressed it against the split skin, the cold making him shake. "This is bad," Eleanor said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You need a doctor." "Then we better get to town." Caleb pushed her hands away and stood up, moving slowly but deliberately. His jaw was clenched so hard Eleanor could see the muscle jumping. She rewrapped his ribs as tight as she dared, then helped him into his shirt and coat. He swayed slightly when he bent to pick up his pack, and Eleanor grabbed his arm to steady him. "You can't walk 12 miles like this," she said. "Watch me." They left the barn and stepped back into the frozen world. The sun was up but gave no warmth, just hard light that made the snow glare white enough to hurt Eleanor's eyes. She could see their tracks from yesterday, already partially filled in by wind-blown snow. They walked. Each step was agony. Eleanor could see it in the way Caleb moved, the way he held himself. But he didn't complain, didn't ask to rest, just kept putting one foot in front of the other. By noon, they'd covered maybe 4 miles, 8 left to go. The sun was high and cold, and Eleanor's legs felt like they were made of wood. Caleb was moving slower now, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. "We need to rest," Eleanor said. "Can't. Gotta keep moving." "Caleb." He stumbled, caught himself, kept walking. Eleanor grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "Look at me," she said. He turned, and she saw his pupils were dilated, his skin gray under the cold burn flush on his cheeks. "You're going into shock," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You need to rest. Now." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, then his eyes rolled back and his knees buckled. Eleanor tried to catch him, but he was too heavy. They both went down hard into the snow. "Caleb!" She rolled him onto his back, tapping his face. "Caleb, wake up!" His eyes fluttered open. "What happened?" "You passed out. We need to stop. You need rest." "Can't stop. Not safe." "It's not safe to keep going either." Eleanor looked around wildly. They were in the middle of nowhere, no shelter, no trees, just open prairie buried in snow. And it was Christmas Eve. The thought hit her like a punch. Christmas Eve. She'd been so focused on surviving, on escaping, that she'd completely lost track of the date. But it was Christmas Eve, and they were stuck in the middle of nowhere with Caleb bleeding and going into shock and 8 miles still to go. "We're going to die out here," Caleb said quietly. No, we're not." Eleanor pulled him into a sitting position, ignoring his groan of pain. "We're not dying. Not today. Not like this." She looked at the landscape again, searching for anything that could help them. And there, maybe a 1/4 mile to the east, she saw what might be a depression in the land. Could be a creek bed. Could be nothing. But it was their only chance. "Can you walk if I help you?" she asked. "I can try." Eleanor got him to his feet, tucking herself under his arm to take some of his weight. They started toward the depression, moving so slowly it felt like they weren't moving at all. Caleb's breathing was ragged against her ear, and she could feel him trembling. But they made it, and it was a creek bed, frozen solid but with banks high enough to provide some shelter from the wind. Eleanor helped Caleb slide down into it, then followed, her own legs nearly giving out. They huddled together at the bottom of the creek bed. Caleb's eyes were closed, his face gray. Eleanor pressed her hand to his forehead and found it burning despite the cold. Fever. The wound must be infected. She wanted to scream, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. They'd come so far, had almost made it, and now this. "Eleanor." Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here. If I don't make it, you're going to make it. Listen." He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "If I don't make it, you keep going. Get to town. Tell them what happened. Get yourself to Laramie. Find Morrison. Tell him Caleb Mercer sent you. He'll help you. Stop talking like you're dying. Promise me." Tears burned in Eleanor's eyes. "I promise, but you're not dying. You hear me? You're not allowed to die." Caleb smiled slightly. "You're bossy when you're scared." "I'm not scared." "Liar." She was terrified, more terrified than she'd been in 3 years, because somehow in the space of 5 days, this stranger had become important, had become someone she couldn't afford to lose. Eleanor wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, trying to share what little warmth she had. Above them, the sun continued its arc across the pale sky, and Eleanor made a decision. She wasn't giving up, not on Caleb, not on herself, not on the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could both survive this. She would get them to town if she had to carry him on her back. She would find help. She would not let him die. Not today. Not ever. Eleanor stayed in that creek bed with Caleb for maybe an hour, watching the fever take hold. His skin burned under her hands, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes talking to people who weren't there. Once he called out for Sarah. Eleanor held him tighter and didn't let herself think about what that meant. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when she made her decision. They couldn't stay here. Another night in the open would kill them both. She had to get help, and that meant leaving him. The thought made her sick, but there was no other choice. Caleb. She shook him gently. Caleb, can you hear me? His eyes opened, unfocused. Eleanor? I need to go get help. I'm going to leave you here and walk to town. I'll bring back a wagon, a doctor, whatever I can find. But I need you to stay awake if you can. Keep moving. Don't let yourself fall asleep. Don't go. His hand gripped her arm weakly. Stay. I can't. You'll die if I stay. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. I will come back for you, I promise, but I have to go now. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Hurry. Eleanor kissed his forehead, a quick press of cold lips to burning skin, then climbed out of the creek bed. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she'd lose her nerve. She walked. 8 miles had never seemed so far. Every step felt like moving through molasses, her legs heavy and uncooperative. The sun sank lower, painting the snow orange and pink, and Eleanor kept walking. Her feet went numb. Her lungs burned. She kept walking. She thought about Caleb lying in that creek bed, fever eating him alive. Thought about how he'd saved her life by knocking on her door. How he'd given her food when he barely had enough for himself. How he'd looked at her like she mattered. She walked faster. Darkness fell when she was maybe 3 miles from town. The temperature dropped so fast Eleanor could feel it, the air turning sharp enough to cut. Her breath came in clouds that froze on her scarf, creating a shell of ice around her mouth and nose. She pulled the scarf down and kept walking, even though the cold air felt like swallowing glass. Stars appeared overhead, hard and bright. No moon yet, just darkness and snow and the distant hope of lights that might be town or might be her mind playing tricks. Eleanor stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Her vision was starting to blur at the edges. Exhaustion or hypothermia, probably both. Didn't matter, she just had to keep moving. One foot, then the other, then the first one again. She'd lost all sense of time when she saw them, actual lights, warm and yellow, spreading across the darkness ahead. Town. Real town, not a hallucination. Eleanor wanted to cry with relief, but she was too cold for tears. She just aimed herself toward those lights and kept walking. The first building she reached was a livery stable on the edge of town. Light showed through the cracks around the door, and she could hear horses moving inside. Eleanor hammered on the door with fists she couldn't feel anymore. Help! Her voice came out as a croak. Please, I need help! The door swung open and a man stood there, middle-aged, barrel-chested, holding a pitchfork like he expected trouble. His expression went from suspicious to shocked when he saw her. Christ almighty, woman, get in here! He pulled her inside and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. Eleanor's knees buckled and the man caught her, half carrying her to a bench near a wood stove that radiated heat. What happened to you? He demanded. Where'd you come from? My friend. Eleanor forced the words out through chattering teeth. He's hurt. Fever. Creek bed about 8 miles northeast. Need a wagon. Need a doctor. 8 miles? In this cold? How are you even alive? Please. Eleanor grabbed his shirt. He'll die if we don't get to him. Please. The man studied her face, then nodded. All right, let me get my wagon hitched. You know exactly where he is? I can show you. Like hell you can. You can barely stand. He called over his shoulder. "Billy, get Doc Patterson. Tell him it's an emergency. Then run to the hotel and tell Mrs. Walsh we need a room ready." A boy appeared from somewhere in the back, maybe 12 years old. He stared at Eleanor with wide eyes. "Go!" the man barked, and the boy took off running. The man turned back to Eleanor. "Name's Frank Cooper. I run this stable. You sit tight while I get the wagon ready. Drink this." He pressed a flask into her hands. Eleanor took a swallow and nearly choked. Whiskey, harsh and burning, but it spread warmth through her chest, and she took another drink. Frank moved with efficient speed, hitching 2 horses to a wagon and loading blankets into the back. Eleanor watched through the haze of exhaustion, clutching the flask. "You coming?" Frank asked when he was ready. "Yes." "Stubborn. I can see that." He helped her up onto the wagon seat. "Point the way and try not to fall off." They rolled out into the darkness, the wagon lurching over frozen ruts. Eleanor directed Frank back the way she'd come, using the stars to navigate. Her whole body ached, but she couldn't rest. Not until they found Caleb. The miles crawled by. Frank didn't try to make conversation, just kept the horses moving at the fastest pace the terrain allowed. Eleanor gripped the seat and stared into the darkness, looking for landmarks. "There," she said finally, pointing. "That rise. The creek bed is just beyond it." Frank urged the horses forward. They crested the rise, and Eleanor saw the depression in the snow where she'd left Caleb. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "Caleb!" she shouted. "Caleb, can you hear me?" No response. Frank brought the wagon as close as he could, then grabbed a lantern and climbed down. Eleanor followed, sliding more than climbing, her numb feet barely holding her weight. They scrambled down into the creek bed, and Eleanor saw him, Caleb, exactly where she'd left him, covered in a thin layer of snow. He wasn't moving. "No, no, no, no!" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, pulling off her glove to press her fingers against his throat. There. A pulse. Faint, but there. "He's alive," she gasped. "Barely." Frank was already moving, brushing snow off Caleb's body. "Help me get him up to the wagon." Between the two of them, they managed to haul Caleb up the bank. He didn't wake, didn't respond at all as they loaded him into the wagon bed. Frank wrapped him in blankets while Eleanor climbed in beside him, pulling his head into her lap. "Hold on," she whispered. "Just hold on." The ride back to town was eternal. Every jolt of the wagon made Eleanor wince, afraid it would be the thing that finally killed Caleb. She kept her hand on his chest, feeling the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. "Come on," she said. "Don't you dare die on me. Not after everything. You hear me? Don't you dare." Caleb didn't answer. Town appeared again, and Frank drove straight to a building with a light in the window. The doctor's office, Eleanor assumed. A man came out before they'd even stopped, black bag in hand. "Inside," he said. "Quickly." They carried Caleb into a small room that smelled like carbolic and old blood. The doctor, Patterson, Eleanor remembered, directed them to put him on a narrow bed. Then he shooed Frank and Eleanor out. "I need space to work. Go sit in the waiting room." Eleanor wanted to argue, but Frank took her arm and pulled her away. They sat on hard wooden chairs in a room lit by a single oil lamp, and Eleanor finally let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. Her hands shook. Her whole body shook. The cold had gotten so deep into her bones she wasn't sure she'd ever be warm again. "You did good," Frank said quietly. "Walking that far in the dark. Most people wouldn't have made it." "I had to." "Why?" "Who is he to you?" Eleanor opened her mouth to say he was just someone who'd helped her, but that wasn't true. She didn't know what Caleb was to her exactly. They'd known each other less than a week. But he was important. He mattered. "He's my friend," she said finally. Frank nodded, like that explained everything. Maybe it did. They waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. Frank dozed off in his chair, but Eleanor couldn't sleep. She just stared at the closed door to the examination room and willed Caleb to live. When the door finally opened, Eleanor shot to her feet. Patterson came out, wiping his hands on a cloth. His expression was carefully neutral. "Well?" Eleanor demanded. "He's alive." "Barely. He's got a broken rib that punctured his lung. Not badly, but enough to cause problems. The wound in his side is infected. He's burning with fever. Patterson paused. If you'd waited another few hours, he'd be dead. As it is, the next day or two will tell. Can I see him? He's not conscious. I don't care. Can I see him? Patterson sighed. 5 minutes. Then you need to let him rest. And you need rest yourself. When's the last time you ate? Eleanor tried to remember and couldn't. I don't know. That's what I thought. Go see your friend, then get yourself to the hotel. Mrs. Walsh will have food and a warm bed for you. I'm not leaving him. You'll be no good to him if you collapse. See him, then go. You can come back in the morning. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She just nodded and went into the room. Caleb looked terrible. His skin was gray-white except for the fever flush on his cheeks. Someone had stripped him to the waist and bandaged his ribs properly, tight white cotton stained with blood. His breathing was shallow and raspy. Eleanor sat in the chair beside the bed and took his hand. It was burning hot. I came back, she said quietly, like I promised. You're in town now. The doctor says you're going to be okay, but you have to fight. You hear me? You have to fight. Caleb's eyes moved under his closed lids, but he didn't wake. Eleanor sat there until Patterson came back and physically escorted her out. Frank was waiting, and he walked her to the hotel, a 2-story building with actual glass windows and smoke coming from multiple chimneys. Inside, warmth enveloped her. A woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes appeared immediately. You must be the one Frank told me about. Come, dear, let's get you warm and fed, Mrs. Walsh led Eleanor upstairs to a small room with an actual bed, a real bed with a mattress and clean sheets and quilts piled thick. There was a basin of warm water, soap that smelled like lavender, and a nightgown laid out on the bed. Wash up and change, Mrs. Walsh said. I'll bring you food. Eleanor was too exhausted to do more than nod. When Mrs. Walsh left, she stripped off her frozen clothes and washed with the warm water, scrubbing away days of dirt and sweat and fear. Her body was a map of bruises and scrapes, and she'd lost more weight than she'd thought. Her ribs showed sharp under her skin. She pulled on the nightgown, soft flannel that felt like heaven, and was sitting on the bed when Mrs. Walsh returned with a tray. Soup, bread, cheese, coffee. Real food. Eat slowly, Mrs. Walsh warned. Your stomach won't thank you if you rush. Eleanor forced herself to eat properly, even though she wanted to inhale everything. The soup was chicken and vegetables, rich and hot. The bread was fresh, soft inside with a crispy crust. She ate until her stomach felt like it might burst, then drank the coffee. Real coffee, strong and sweet. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank me yet. You can pay for the room once you're back on your feet. Mrs. Walsh studied her. Where you from, dear? Homestead about 18 miles from here? Or I was. I left. Smart girl. This is no country for a woman alone. She patted Eleanor's hand. Get some sleep. Things will look better in the morning. But when Mrs. Walsh left and Eleanor lay down in that warm, soft bed, sleep wouldn't come. She kept seeing Caleb's gray face, kept hearing his labored breathing, kept thinking about how close she'd come to losing him. And that's when it hit her, the weight of everything that had happened. 5 days ago, she'd been ready to die, had been waiting for it, almost hoping for it, and now here she was, in a warm bed with food in her belly, fighting to save someone else's life. When had that changed? When had she started caring again? Eleanor didn't have an answer. She just knew that somewhere between Caleb knocking on her door and this moment, something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't ready to die anymore. She wanted to live. The realization should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt terrifying. Because wanting to live meant she could lose again, could hurt again, could fail again. But maybe that was the point. Maybe living meant risking all of it. Eleanor pulled the quilts up to her chin and finally let herself sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window, actual bright sunlight, not the weak gray light she'd gotten used to. Christmas morning. The thought came with a jolt of disorientation. Last year she'd spent Christmas alone in the cabin, burning Thomas's chair and eating the last of her flour. This year she was in a hotel room in town, wearing a borrowed nightgown, and the man who'd saved her life was fighting for his in a doctor's office down the street. Eleanor dressed quickly in her old clothes, now dry but still worn and patched, and hurried downstairs. Mrs. Walsh was in the dining room setting out breakfast for other guests. "How's your friend?" she asked when she saw Eleanor. "I don't know. I'm going to the doctor's now." "Eat first. You won't help him by starving yourself." Mrs. Walsh was right, and Eleanor forced herself to sit and eat eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, food she hadn't seen in months. It tasted like a dream. Then she walked to the doctor's office, her heart in her throat. Patterson was in the examination room when she arrived, checking Caleb's pulse. He looked up when Eleanor entered. "He made it through the night," Patterson said. "That's good. The fever's still high, but it hasn't gotten worse. If we can break it in the next day or two, he's got a chance." "Can I sit with him?" "If you want. Won't make much difference. He's not conscious. But if it makes you feel better, go ahead." Eleanor pulled the chair close to Caleb's bedside and settled in. He looked the same as last night, gray, fevered, barely breathing. But he was alive. That counted for something. She talked to him. Didn't know if he could hear her, but she talked anyway. Told him about the hotel, about Mrs. Walsh's cooking, about the bright sunshine outside. Told him he needed to wake up because they still had to get to Laramie, still had to see Morrison's ranch, still had to figure out what came next. "You promised me we'd survive," she said. "Both of us. So you need to keep that promise, you hear me? You need to wake up." Caleb's eyelids flickered, but he didn't wake. Eleanor stayed all morning. Patterson brought her coffee and told her she was wasting her time, but she ignored him. Someone brought her lunch, Mrs. Walsh again probably, and Eleanor ate without leaving Caleb's side. Late afternoon, his fever spiked. Eleanor watched helplessly as Caleb's body went rigid, tremors running through him. Patterson came rushing in when she called, pressing cold compresses to Caleb's forehead and chest. "This is the crisis point," Patterson said grimly. "Either the fever breaks tonight or it kills him." "What can I do?" "Keep him cool. Talk to him if you want. Beyond that, it's up to his body whether it fights this off or not." Eleanor spent that night in the chair, changing cold compresses, talking until her voice went hoarse, willing Caleb to live. At some point, Frank stopped by, bringing her more coffee and a blanket. At another point, Mrs. Walsh appeared with soup. Eleanor barely registered either of them. All her focus was on Caleb, on the rise and fall of his chest, on the heat radiating from his skin, on the occasional murmurs that escaped his lips, words she couldn't make out, names she didn't know. "Come on," she whispered. "Fight. Please, fight." Near dawn, something changed. The tremors eased. Caleb's breathing deepened. Eleanor pressed her hand to his forehead and found it cooler. Not cool, but cooler than it had been. She ran to get Patterson, who examined Caleb with professional efficiency. "Fever's breaking," he said, and Eleanor could have wept with relief. "He's not out of the woods yet, but this is good. Very good." Eleanor sank back into her chair, suddenly boneless with exhaustion and relief. Caleb was going to live. He was actually going to live. She must have fallen asleep then, because the next thing she knew, someone was shaking her shoulder. Eleanor jerked awake to find Patterson standing over her, looking amused. "Your friend's awake," he said. Eleanor's head whipped toward the bed. Caleb's eyes were open, actually open and focused. When he saw her, he managed a weak smile. "Hey," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hey yourself." Eleanor grabbed his hand, squeezing it probably too hard. "You scared the hell out of me." "Sorry. You should be. I walked 8 miles in the dark to save your stupid life." "I know. I remember." His smile widened slightly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just don't ever do that again." "Deal." They stared at each other, and Eleanor felt something shift between them. Something that had been building since he knocked on her door and she'd let him in. Something that went deeper than gratitude or convenience. Patterson cleared his throat. "He needs rest. And so do you. Go back to the hotel, get some real sleep. He'll be here when you get back." Eleanor wanted to argue, but Caleb squeezed her hand. "Go," he said. "I'm okay now. You need rest." So she went, stumbling back to the hotel in the bright morning light. The town was coming alive around her, people on the streets, shops opening, the sound of church bells ringing somewhere. Christmas. She'd forgotten again. Mrs. Walsh took one look at her and sent her straight upstairs. Eleanor collapsed into bed and slept for 14 hours straight. When she woke, it was the day after Christmas. She'd slept through the entire holiday. The thought should have bothered her, but it didn't. She felt better than she had in years, rested, fed, clean, alive. She visited Caleb every day, watched him get stronger, watched the color come back to his face. They talked about everything and nothing, made plans for Laramie, argued about whether Eleanor should pay for her hotel room with money she didn't have. "Morrison will pay you back when we get there," Caleb insisted. "I'm not taking charity." "It's not charity. It's an advance on work you'll do at the ranch." They went around in circles until finally Eleanor just gave up and let Frank put it on Caleb's tab. She'd find a way to pay him back eventually. A week after Christmas, Patterson declared Caleb well enough to travel. Not fully healed, that would take months, but strong enough to make the trip to Laramie in easy stages. Frank helped them outfit for the journey. He sold Eleanor a horse, a sturdy mare who'd seen better days but was reliable, at a price so low it had to be charity disguised as business. Got them supplies, blankets, everything they'd need. "You two take care of each other," he said the morning they left. "We will," Eleanor promised. They rode out of town just after dawn, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Eleanor looked back once, seeing the town shrink behind them, then turned forward, toward Laramie, toward whatever came next. Caleb rode beside her, moving carefully but moving, alive. They were both alive. And for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt something that might have been hope. The ride to Laramie took 4 days instead of 2. Caleb couldn't manage more than a few hours in the saddle before the pain in his ribs forced them to stop. Eleanor didn't complain. They camped early each night, found sheltered spots, built small fires, moved like people who had nowhere urgent to be and all the time in the world to get there. Which was a lie, of course. They were both running low on money. The supplies Frank had sold them wouldn't last forever, and winter still had months left to tighten its grip. But Eleanor found she didn't mind the slow pace. After 3 years of waiting for death, she was in no rush to reach whatever came next. On the third night, camped in a grove of cottonwoods that blocked most of the wind, Caleb asked the question she'd been expecting. "What are you going to do when we get there?" Eleanor poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral up into the dark. "You said I could work at the ranch." "You can, but is that what you want?" "I don't know what I want. I haven't thought about wanting anything in so long I don't remember how." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You could go back to Boston. Your sister's still there, right? From the letters?" "Rebecca." "Yeah, she's still there." Eleanor pulled one of those letters from her coat pocket. She'd been carrying them since leaving the cabin. "She writes every few months. Tells me about her children, her husband's business, the weather. Always ends the same way. Come home, Eleanor. There's nothing for you out there." She might be right. "I know, that's the problem." Eleanor refolded the letter carefully. "If I go back, I prove her right about everything, about Thomas being a dreamer, about the West being too hard, about me being too stubborn for my own good. That's still a stupid reason not to go." "I know that too." They sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind move through the cottonwoods. Finally, Eleanor asked the question that had been bothering her since they left town. "What happens when we get to Morrison's ranch? Really? I show up with you. A woman you picked up somewhere, no skills worth mentioning, no money. Why would he let me stay?" "Because I'll tell him to." "And if he says no?" Caleb looked at her across the fire. "Then we'll figure something else out." "We? You think I'm just going to dump you somewhere and ride off, after everything?" He shook his head. "We're in this together now, Eleanor, however it works out." The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Eleanor's chest tight with something she couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or hope, or both. "What if Morrison doesn't want a partner?" she asked. "What if you get there and the ranch is a disaster? What then?" "Then we keep moving, find something else." Caleb added a piece of wood to the fire. "I've been drifting for over a year now. Another few months won't kill me." You're not worried about running out of money? Always worried about that. But worrying doesn't change anything. We'll figure it out when we have to. Eleanor wanted his confidence, wanted to believe that things would just work out through some combination of luck and determination. But she'd spent too many years watching things fall apart to trust in easy outcomes. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Of what? Everything. Morrison saying no. The ranch being terrible. Winter lasting forever. Running out of money and ending up worse off than before. She paused. You dying, me dying, both of us dying. That's a lot of scared. I know. Caleb stood up, moving carefully, and came around the fire to sit beside her. He didn't touch her, just sat close enough that she could feel his warmth. Here's what I know, he said. 2 weeks ago, you were ready to die in that cabin. I was half dead in a snowstorm. Now we're both alive, sitting by a fire, heading somewhere that might be good or might be terrible, but at least it's somewhere. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. No, but it's a start. He bumped his shoulder against hers gently. We survived the worst of it, Eleanor. Everything from here is just details. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that surviving the storm and the infection and the 8-mile walk in the dark meant they'd earned some kind of reprieve. But life didn't work that way. Surviving one disaster didn't protect you from the next. Still, they were alive. They were moving forward. That had to count for something. Tell me about Morrison, Eleanor said. What's he like? Honest, hard worker, bit of a temper, but fair. We worked together for about 2 years before he moved out here. He knows cattle, knows land management. If anyone can make a ranch work in Wyoming, it's him. You like him. I respect him. That's more important than like. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter against the cold. What if I don't fit in there? Then you don't, but you won't know until you try. Caleb looked at her. Stop trying to predict every way this might fail. You'll drive yourself crazy. Too late for that. He laughed, and the sound made something ease in Eleanor's chest. They stayed up talking until the fire burned low, then settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the coals. Eleanor lay awake long after Caleb's breathing evened out into sleep, staring at the stars through the cottonwood branches and wondering what the hell she was doing. They reached Laramie late afternoon the next day. The town sprawled across the prairie like someone had dumped a box of buildings and let them fall where they would. Eleanor counted at least 3 hotels, twice as many saloons, a train depot with actual trains sitting on the tracks, and more people on the streets than she'd seen in years. It's huge, she said. Wait until you see Denver. Caleb pointed down the main street. Morrison's ranch is about 8 miles west of town. We can stay in Laramie tonight if you want, head out in the morning. Eleanor shook her head. Let's just get there. I want to know what we're dealing with. They rode through town, Eleanor trying not to stare at everything. The stores with glass windows displaying goods. The restaurant with actual menus posted outside. The women in dresses that weren't patched and faded. This was civilization, real civilization, not the frontier pretending to be something it wasn't. She felt like a ghost. Like if she touched anything, it would dissolve, revealing the truth that she didn't belong here. West of town, the landscape opened up into rolling prairie marked by fence lines and cattle. Not as many cattle as Eleanor would have expected, probably brought in for winter, Caleb explained, but enough to show this was working ranch country. Morrison's place appeared just as the sun was touching the horizon. A main house, decent-sized, with smoke coming from the chimney. A barn that looked new. A bunkhouse, corrals. Everything neat and maintained. Looks good, Caleb said, and Eleanor heard the relief in his voice. They rode into the yard and a man came out of the house, tall, maybe 40, with a full beard and a cautious expression. When he saw Caleb, his face broke into a grin. Mercer, about damn time. I was starting to think you'd decided not to come. Then he noticed Eleanor, and the grin faded into confusion. Who's this? Eleanor Whitmore. She's with me. Caleb dismounted carefully, and Morrison came forward to grip his hand. Good to see you, Jack. You too, though you look like hell if I'm being honest. Morrison's sharp eyes took in the way Caleb moved, the careful way he held himself. What happened? Long story. Got caught in that storm week before Christmas. Cracked some ribs. Been recovering. Morrison looked at Eleanor again. She part of that story? Yeah, she helped save my life, actually. Eleanor, this is Jack Morrison. Jack. Eleanor. Eleanor dismounted and nodded, feeling Morrison's eyes assess her. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either, calculating. Pleasure, Morrison said, though his tone suggested he hadn't decided yet if it was. Come inside, both of you. It's too cold to stand around talking. The main house was warm and well-furnished, nothing fancy, but solid. A fire burned in the hearth. The smell of something cooking came from the kitchen. Morrison gestured them toward chairs. Coffee? Whiskey? Coffee, Caleb said. Eleanor just nodded. Morrison poured 3 cups and settled into a chair across from them. All right, let's hear this long story. Caleb told it, most of it anyway. The storm. Finding Eleanor's cabin. Getting hurt on the way to town. He left out some of the details, like how close they'd both come to dying. Like the 8 miles Eleanor had walked in the dark. Just gave Morrison the broad strokes. When he finished, Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. So what's your plan now? Caleb mentioned bringing you here, but he didn't say why. Eleanor felt her face flush. I need work. Somewhere to stay while I figure out what's next. Caleb said there might be a place here. Did he now? Morrison's expression was unreadable. What can you do? Cook, clean, basic medical care, farm work if needed, though I'm better with gardens than cattle. Eleanor forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for my keep. Room and board, then. No wages. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. That's fair. Morrison studied her a moment longer, then nodded. All right. You can stay in the house for now. There's a spare room upstairs. We'll figure out something more permanent later if you decide to stay. He turned to Caleb. As for you and me, we should talk business, but that can wait until tomorrow. You both look exhausted. Relief flooded through Eleanor so suddenly her eyes stung. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of Morrison. Thank you, she managed. Don't thank me yet. You might hate it here. Morrison stood. I'll show you the room. Caleb knows where the bunkhouse is. Eleanor followed Morrison upstairs to a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was clean and warm and safe. Supper's in an hour, Morrison said from the doorway. Come down when you're ready. Then he left, and Eleanor was alone. She sat on the bed, a real bed with an actual mattress, and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. Relief, fear, exhaustion, hope. It all crashed over her at once, and this time she did cry. Quiet tears that slid down her face and dripped onto her hands. She'd made it. Against all odds, against every reason to give up, she'd made it to somewhere that wasn't that cabin. Somewhere she might actually survive. Now she just had to figure out how to do more than survive. How to actually live. The first weeks at Morrison's ranch were strange. Eleanor threw herself into work, partly because she needed to earn her keep, and partly because staying busy kept her from thinking too much. She cooked meals for Morrison and the 3 ranch hands who worked for him, cleaned the house, mended clothes, fixed things that were broken. The men treated her with careful politeness, like she was a puzzle they hadn't figured out yet. Morrison remained cautiously neutral. The ranch hands, 2 brothers named Tom and Charlie, and an older man called Dutch, were friendly enough but kept their distance. Caleb spent most of his time with Morrison, going over books and riding out to look at cattle and discussing the partnership in detail. Eleanor saw him at meals and sometimes in the evenings, but he was focused on the business, on making sure this opportunity was solid before committing. Eleanor told herself she didn't mind the distance, told herself it was good that Caleb was focused on his own future instead of worrying about her. But she missed him, missed their conversations by the fire, missed the way he'd looked at her like she mattered. 3 weeks after they arrived, Morrison and Caleb finalized the partnership. Caleb bought a 40% stake in the ranch with money Eleanor hadn't known he had. Apparently he'd sold his Colorado place for more than he'd let on. Morrison kept majority control, but Caleb would run the day-to-day operations come spring. They celebrated with whiskey and a dinner Eleanor cooked that was probably too fancy for a ranch house, but no one complained. The mood was good, optimistic. Plans were made for expanding the herd, improving the irrigation, maybe building another barn. Eleanor sat at the table and felt separate from all of it. This was Caleb and Morrison's future, the ranch hand's livelihood. What was it to her? She was just temporary help, a charity case who'd eventually move on to whatever came next. After dinner, she escaped to the kitchen to clean up. She was elbow deep in dishwater when Caleb appeared in the doorway. "Need help?" he asked. "I've got it." He came in anyway, picking up a towel to dry the plate she'd washed. They worked in silence for a few minutes before Caleb spoke. "You've been quiet lately." "Just tired." "Liar." Eleanor scrubbed a pot harder than necessary. "Fine. I've been thinking." "About?" "What I'm doing here. What comes next?" She rinsed the pot and handed it to him. "You and Morrison have your partnership. The ranch is set. You don't need me here." "That's not true." "It is. I appreciate everything you've done, Caleb. Really. But I can't just stay here forever cooking and cleaning and taking up space." Caleb set down the towel and turned to face her. "Is that what you think you're doing? Taking up space?" "What else would you call it?" "Contributing, working, being part of something." He paused. "Being home." The word hit Eleanor harder than it should have. "This isn't my home." "Why not?" "Because I don't belong here. I'm passing through until I figure out where I actually belong." "And where's that? Boston? Back to your sister who you're too proud to face? Somewhere else where you don't know anyone and have nothing?" Caleb's voice was sharp now, frustrated. "Eleanor, you're so busy looking for reasons this won't work that you're not seeing what's right in front of you." "Which is what?" "A place. People who appreciate you. Work that matters. A future, if you want it." Eleanor turned away, focusing on the dishwater. "I don't know what I want." "Then stay until you figure it out. What's the harm?" The harm was that staying meant risking caring, meant letting herself get attached to this place, these people, this life. And she'd already lost too much to risk that again. But she didn't say any of that, just nodded and said, "Okay, I'll stay for now." Caleb looked like he wanted to say more, but Morrison called him from the other room, and the moment passed. Winter deepened. February came with storms that buried the ranch in snow and kept everyone inside for days at a time. Eleanor settled into a routine. Cooking, cleaning, reading books from Morrison's small library, playing cards with the ranch hands when they were snowed in and bored. Slowly, without meaning to, she became part of the rhythm of the place. She learned that Tom and Charlie were from Nebraska and had followed Morrison west looking for work. The Dutch was 63 and had worked ranches his whole life and could predict weather better than any almanac. That Morrison was gruff but fair, and underneath the rough exterior was someone who genuinely cared about the people who worked for him. And she learned that Caleb was good at this, good at managing men, good at planning, good at seeing what needed to be done and making it happen. He'd found his purpose here in a way he hadn't found anywhere else. Watching him thrive made Eleanor happy and miserable in equal measure. Happy because he deserved this, miserable because she still felt like she was drifting. In March, a letter arrived from Rebecca. It had been forwarded from the town near Eleanor's old cabin, passed along by someone who'd remembered her, then forwarded again to Laramie. By the time it reached Morrison's ranch, it was 3 months old. Eleanor opened it sitting on her bed, the paper crackling in her hands. The letter was classic Rebecca, newsy and cheerful with an undercurrent of worry. She wrote about her children, about Boston society, about the new house they'd bought. And then, at the end, the plea Eleanor had been expecting. "Please come home, Eleanor. I know you're angry at me for being right about Thomas and the West. But that doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you're my sister, and I miss you, and I want you safe. There's a place for you here. Always. You just have to be brave enough to take it." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, then sat staring at nothing. Rebecca was right. There was a place for her in Boston. A comfortable, safe place where she'd never have to worry about starving or freezing or dying alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. All she had to do was admit defeat and go home. That evening, Eleanor found Caleb in the barn checking on a mare who was due to foal. He looked up when she came in, smiling. "Hey, what's up?" Eleanor handed him the letter. "I got this today." Caleb read it, his expression growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. "You gonna go?" I don't know. That's honest, at least. They stood in the barn, the mare shifting in her stall behind them, the smell of hay and horses thick in the air. Would you go? Eleanor asked. If it was you, if you had a sister offering you everything you needed, would you go? Caleb thought about it. A year ago, no. I would have said I needed to keep moving, keep running from the grief. But now? He paused. I think I'd ask myself what I was going toward, not just what I was running from. And what am I going toward here? That's not a question I can answer for you. Eleanor looked around the barn. It was well maintained, organized. Morrison ran a tight operation. Through the open door, she could see the main house, smoke rising from the chimney, warm light in the windows. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. Do what? Start over. Build something new. Trust that it won't all fall apart. She met his eyes. I spent 3 years watching everything die. Thomas, the land, my hope. How do I let myself believe in something again? Caleb came closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cold barn. You just do. One day at a time, one choice at a time. Same way you survived. You just keep going until one day you realize you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. What if I fail? What if you succeed? Eleanor wanted to argue, to list all the ways this could go wrong. But she was tired of being afraid, tired of protecting herself from pain by refusing to want anything. I want to stay, she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. I want to stay here and see what happens. Is that crazy? No crazier than anything else we've done. Morrison might not want me here permanently. Then we'll figure something else out. But you won't know unless you ask. Eleanor nodded slowly. Okay, I'll ask. She did the next morning. Found Morrison in his office going over accounts and asked if they could talk. He set down his pen and gestured to the chair across from his desk. What's on your mind? I want to stay, permanently, I mean, not just as temporary help. The words came out in a rush. I know I'm not essential to the operation. I know you could find someone else to cook and clean, but I work hard and I pull my weight, and I think I could be useful here. If you'll have me. Morrison studied her for a long moment. What changed? When you got here, you were barely holding yourself together. Now you're asking for a future. I stopped waiting to die. Started figuring out how to live instead. Because of Caleb? The question caught Eleanor off guard. What? You and Caleb? There's something there I should know about? No, I mean, we're friends, that's all. Morrison raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. All right, here's what I'll offer. You stay on, same as you've been doing. Room, board, and I'll start paying you wages. Not much, $20 a month to start. You prove yourself valuable, we'll renegotiate. Fair? $20 a month. Eleanor hadn't had her own money in 3 years. The amount was small, but it felt enormous. More than fair, thank you. Don't thank me, thank Caleb. He's been pushing me to make this official since you got here. Morrison picked up his pen again. Now get out of here. I've got work to do. Eleanor left the office in a daze. Caleb had been pushing for this? Why hadn't he said anything? She found him later, repairing fence in one of the corrals. He looked up when she approached, shading his eyes against the sun. Morrison said yes, Eleanor announced. Good. About time. He also said you'd been pushing him to make it official. Why didn't you tell me? Caleb shrugged. Didn't want you to feel pressured. Wanted it to be your choice. It is my choice, and I'm choosing to stay. Good. He went back to his fence work, but Eleanor could see the smile he was trying to hide. Spring came late and hard. Snow melted into mud that made everything difficult. But with the thaw came work, real work that needed doing. Caleb and Morrison and the ranch hands were out from dawn to dusk, checking cattle, repairing winter damage, preparing for the season ahead. Eleanor threw herself into her own work. She expanded the kitchen garden, planting vegetables that would feed them through the next winter. Started keeping chickens. Took over some of Morrison's bookkeeping when she saw how behind he'd gotten during the busy season. And slowly, day by day, she became essential. Not because anyone had made her essential, but because she'd made herself that way through sheer determination and hard work. The ranch hands stopped treating her like a temporary fixture and started treating her like family. Morrison relaxed around her, started actually listening when she made suggestions. The place ran smoother with her there, and everyone knew it, including Caleb. They'd fallen into an easy partnership, working together on projects, talking over morning coffee, sitting on the porch in the evenings when the work was done. Eleanor had never had a friendship like this, built on mutual respect and shared experience and the knowledge that they'd saved each other's lives. But friendship wasn't all she felt, and she was pretty sure Caleb felt the same way. She didn't know when it had shifted from gratitude to something more. Maybe it had always been there, buried under the survival and the fear. Or maybe it had grown slowly day by day as they'd built this new life together. Either way, by the time early summer arrived, Eleanor was in love with Caleb Mercer. She didn't tell him, couldn't figure out how to say it, or if she even should. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if he did but didn't want to complicate their partnership? What if everything fell apart because she couldn't keep her feelings to herself? So she said nothing, just kept working, kept being his friend, kept pretending her heart didn't race when he smiled at her. In June, Morrison announced he was taking a trip to Denver to look at bulls for breeding stock. He'd be gone 2 weeks, and Caleb would run the ranch while he was away. The night before Morrison left, Eleanor was on the porch watching the sunset when Caleb came out and sat beside her. "You happy here?" he asked. The question surprised her. "Yeah, I am. Why?" "Just making sure. You seemed sad earlier." Eleanor had been thinking about Thomas, something she did less and less but still happened sometimes. The anniversary of his death had passed a few weeks ago, and she'd barely noticed. That realization had made her feel guilty and relieved in equal measure. "Just thinking about the past," she said. "Your husband?" "Yeah. And how far away that life feels now, like it happened to someone else." Caleb nodded. "I get that. Sarah feels that way to me sometimes, like a dream I had once." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to deep blue. "Eleanor," Caleb said finally, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why haven't you written back to your sister?" Eleanor had been avoiding that question for months. "I don't know what to tell her." "How about the truth, that you're okay, that you found a place, that she doesn't need to worry anymore? She'll want me to come visit, meet Morrison, see the ranch, make sure I'm actually okay and not just saying I am. Would that be so bad?" Eleanor thought about it, seeing Rebecca again, letting her sister see that she'd survived, that she'd built something new from the ashes of everything she'd lost. Maybe it wouldn't be defeat. Maybe it would be proof that Eleanor had been strong enough to choose her own path. "No," she said slowly. "I guess it wouldn't be bad. Might even be good." "Then you should write to her." "I will. Tomorrow." Eleanor paused. "Thank you for pushing me. That's what friends do." Friends. The word stung even though Eleanor had no right to want anything more. Caleb, Eleanor. They'd spoken at the same time, stopped at the same time, laughed awkwardly. "You first," Caleb said. Eleanor lost her nerve. "It's nothing. What were you going to say?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her fully. "I was going to say that I don't want to be just friends anymore." Eleanor's heart stopped. "What?" "I've been trying to figure out when to tell you this. Kept talking myself out of it because I didn't want to make things weird or ruin what we have." He took her hand. "But the truth is, I'm in love with you. I think I have been since you let me into that cabin. And if you don't feel the same way, that's okay. We can just forget I said anything and keep being friends, but I needed you to know." Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing. Caleb loved her. Caleb Mercer, who'd saved her life and given her a future, loved her. "Say something," Caleb said quietly. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of this. Of loving someone and losing them again. Of building something and watching it fall apart." Tears were running down her face now. "I can't survive losing someone else, Caleb. I barely survived losing Thomas." "I know. I'm scared too." He squeezed her hand. "But we've survived everything else. We can survive this." "What if we can't?" "Then we can't." "But what if we can?" He used his free hand to wipe tears from her cheek. What if we build something real and it actually works? What if we get to be happy? Eleanor wanted to list all the ways it could go wrong, wanted to protect herself from the possibility of more pain, but she was so tired of being afraid, so tired of refusing to let herself want things. "I love you too," she whispered. Caleb smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that lit up his whole face. "Yeah? Yeah, I think I have been for a while. I just didn't know how to say it." "You just did." He kissed her then, soft and careful, and Eleanor felt something inside her that had been locked tight for 3 years finally open up. She kissed him back, letting herself feel all of it, the love, the hope, the terrifying possibility that maybe this time things would work out. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we figure it out. Together." "I can live with that." Morrison came back from Denver 2 weeks later with 3 new bulls and a knowing look when he saw Eleanor and Caleb standing a little closer than friends usually stood. "About damn time," was all he said. The ranch hands were less subtle. Dutch demanded to know when the wedding would be. Tom and Charlie started a betting pool on how long it would take Caleb to propose. Eleanor found the whole thing embarrassing and sweet in equal measure. Caleb proposed in August, on the porch where he'd first told her he loved her. It wasn't fancy, just him asking if she wanted to make this official, to build a life together, not just as partners in survival, but as partners in everything. Eleanor said yes without hesitation. They married in September in Laramie, with Morrison standing up as best man and a wire sent to Rebecca that brought her west with her whole family to witness her little sister marrying a rancher in Wyoming. Rebecca cried through the whole ceremony, and afterward told Eleanor she'd never been so happy to be proven wrong about anything. Eleanor and Caleb built a small house on the ranch property. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a porch, but it was theirs. They filled it with furniture Caleb made and quilts Eleanor sewed, and the life they were building together piece by piece. The first winter in the house was hard. There were moments when Eleanor woke up panicking, convinced she was back in that dying cabin, alone and starving. But Caleb was always there, pulling her close, reminding her where she was and who she was with. Spring came again, then summer, then another winter. The years passed in the rhythm of ranch work, calving season, branding, roundup, the cycle of growth and harvest and preparation. Eleanor and Caleb expanded the house when their first child came, a daughter they named Sarah, after Caleb's first wife. Rebecca made the trip from Boston to meet her niece and stayed a month, filling the house with noise and opinions and love. More children followed. 2 sons, born 2 years apart, both healthy and loud and demanding. The small house became cramped, so they built bigger, added rooms, then added more rooms. The place grew with them. Morrison died when Eleanor was 38, leaving the ranch to Caleb with the stipulation that Eleanor always had a home there. By then it was a formality. Eleanor had been running half the operation for years, had turned the ranch into something more profitable than Morrison had ever managed alone. Dutch retired. Tom and Charlie left to start their own place. New hands came, learned the business, moved on, or stayed. The ranch kept going, kept growing, kept providing. Through it all, Eleanor and Caleb built their life. Not a perfect life. They fought sometimes, disagreed about how to handle things, struggled through lean years and personal losses. But they built it together, with the same determination they'd used to survive that first brutal winter. On their 20th anniversary, they sat on the porch of the house they'd built together, watching their children play in the yard. Sarah was 17 now, beautiful and fierce. The boys were 15 and 13, already taller than their mother and showing signs they'd be as tall as their father. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Knocking on that cabin door?" Caleb laughed. "Not even once. You?" "Not even once." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they sat there as the sun set over the mountains and the life they'd built spread out around them in every direction. 20 years ago, Eleanor had been standing at a frozen window, ready to let the winter take her. 20 years ago, a knock on the door had changed everything. She thought about that woman sometimes, hollow-eyed and hopeless, clinging to ghosts. Thought about how close she'd come to never knowing any of this. The love, the family, the life that stretched out ahead of her full of possibility. Sometimes surviving wasn't about enduring. Sometimes it was about having the courage to open the door when someone knocked, to accept help, to let yourself hope again even when hope felt impossible. Eleanor had opened that door, had chosen to survive, had chosen to live. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference.